1965. And I thought I would have a young civil rights worker and figure out her story. And then the second idea I had was a young female, again, architect this time, who has a woman come to her office and say that she wants to kill someone. She actually was originally a therapist, my character. She wasn't an architect. And I'm a former psychotherapist and social worker. And I always had a fear of somebody coming to my office and telling me that they wanted to kill someone, because I knew that legally I would have to go through certain steps, plus it would be very scary. I actually came close to it happening one time, and so that has really stayed in my mind. So they were the two ideas that I was playing with, and then I thought, well, what if I connect these two ideas? And that's when the story for The Last House on the Street really came to fruition. So that first story of Ellie, who is 20 years old, and she's a student at the University of North Carolina in Chapel Hill. She is a Southerner, a white Southerner, and she begins to see the civil rights protests on her campus. And at first she doesn't think very much about them, but she is a photographer for the school newspaper. And so she has to cover them. And she begins to really understand what it is that these students are fighting for. She's also influenced by an aunt who is from New York. And she has a reason that the reader doesn't know until much later, a reason that really propels her to want to do civil rights work. So she learns about this group, Scope, that is coming into her area in North Carolina for the summer. And it's made up of white students from the North and from the West who are going to help register Black voters because LBJ is about to sign the Voting Rights Act of 1965. At this time, it's just a bill waiting to be signed. And also at this time, what was happening was a lot of Black people were getting accosted if they went to register. They were made to take literacy tests, which might be reading part of the Constitution and interpreting that part of the Constitution. They might have to pay a poll tax. And a lot of times, if the person who was their landlord or their employer learned that they were registering to vote, they could lose their job, lose their house. So the Civil Rights Act of 1965 was going to put an end to that and give these people who wanted to register, give them federal protection. So these students are coming into the South in order to educate the potential Black voters and help them register. And the reason that white students were picked for this task was because they would get more media attention. That was the thinking, and probably accurate. And so the students, the white students, would partner with a local Black person and go door to door in very, very poor rural areas in this book. It's a rural area. It might have been a town in another state. So Ellie, when Ellie signed on for this, she didn't really realize she was going to be living with a Black family. So she suddenly has an outhouse and no electricity, and there's a lot for her to adjust to and get used to, but she's very, very committed. And her fellow students are very committed too. The KKK in North Carolina was extremely active. It had North Carolina had more Klaverns and KKK members than any other state at that time. So the KKK is a constant threat to these student workers. And there is a romance that comes out of Ellie's work, and it's a doomed romance. So then we go back to Kayla, who is the architect, and a woman comes into her office saying that she wants to add on to her house. And she's very strange. She wears these sunglasses that are mirrored, so Kayla can't see her eyes. She can only see herself reflected. And she has sloppily done nails and a red wig, an obvious red wig, and a strange voice. And she tells Kayla, first she's talking about the project she wants to do, and then she tells Kayla that she's aware that Kayla and her little daughter are about to move into a house that Kayla and her husband designed and built. And Kayla's husband was killed during the building of the house. And the woman says, you don't really want to move into that house, do you? You don't want to move into those woods. And she obviously knows a whole lot about Kayla's life, and Kayla's very disconcerted. And the woman also alludes to the fact that she wants to kill someone. So the woman leaves, Kayla calls the police. This is actually the first chapter of the book. So I'm not giving too much away. And then we start alternating chapters. Ellie's story as a scope worker and Kayla's dealing with fear as she's planning to move into her new house, and strange things start happening. And so the stories do seem very disconnected, but they are actually very connected. And as you read, you'll begin to discover that. So I did a lot of research for this book, as you can imagine. I really got caught up in the whole scope program and learning about it. The students all came down to Georgia for their orientation. There were hundreds of them. And the orientation went on for a week. They met with Andrew Young and other notable Black, at that time, ministers. And Martin Luther King came and spoke to them. And it was a very exciting time for all of these young students. But what I learned in my research, I read a wonderful book called This Bright Light of Ours by Maria Gittin. And Maria had been a 19-year-old scope worker that same summer. And she shared so many of her experiences in this book, and it was hugely, hugely helpful to me. But the thing that really struck me was her honesty in talking about how a 19-year-old or 20-year-old college student is highly motivated to make a change, but also is still just a teenager and sometimes doesn't make the best decisions. And so I had that in mind as I created Ellie. While her motivation is very strong and she really cares about what she's doing and doing the right thing, she's still just a 20-year-old college student. And so at times she and her coworkers make decisions that are not in anybody's best interest. So I would like to stop talking for a little bit and see what questions people have. Kathy, can you share with me what questions are out there, if we've got it?
Absolutely. So let's see, folks, we need more questions in the Q&A. I have lots of questions for you.
Okay.
While we wait for some to come in, I think there's going to be some coming in now. When did you start writing this book? Yeah. When did you start writing the book? That's
Well, a year before it was due. So that's really the way I operate is, I had a contract and it was a year-long contract. And so that's when I started writing. It was a year before it was due. I was finishing up the book before it. And also the way it works is I was going on tour for the book before it and at the same time starting to do the research for this book.
right.
So yeah, it took a year to write, which is usual for me.
And so were you, you weren't, I thought at first when I read the book that you would probably were heavily influenced by, all the things that have been going on in the past few years with race in this country, but maybe that's not true because it was really the scope that your interest in scope that.
Yeah. I really wasn't thinking a whole lot about current day as I wrote it, and current day as I worked on it. Current day was getting worse and worse. I just really didn't realize as I was working on it what sad shape we'd be in right now with all the voting rights bills that are passed and are trying to be passed. It's really distressing to me. And if I can add this, because I get flack about this online sometimes, I'm not talking about photo IDs. If I have no problem with photo IDs, as long as we make it easy for everybody to get a photo ID. If that is a requirement that people want to have, then let's find a way to make it happen. But it's other laws that are being passed that really do target poor people, people of color, such as not having Sunday voting or limiting Sunday voting, which is historically the day that churches would bring their Black church members to the polls. So, and that's just one tiny example. So it's really of concern to me. And it wasn't that much of concern to me when I started writing the book, but it really grew over time.
That makes sense. How challenging was it to write parts of this book? I mean, there had to be some parts that were very difficult, I would think.
Yes, and without going into the really difficult parts, yeah, it was challenging. And a lot of a big concern I had was that I'm white. And although my two point of view characters are both white, there are a lot of Black characters in the story, and I wanted to make sure that I was doing them justice. So I was very worried about that, and so was my editor. And we decided to get a sensitivity reader. So my publisher hired a Black writer and editor who did a wonderful job. She read the whole manuscript. She felt like, from what she said that I pretty much nailed it in terms of the history and the behavior of the characters. Her concern was the language, and that was also my editor's concern. In other words, my editor really would have liked it, and I think the sensitivity reader really would have liked it too, if I used the term Black throughout the manuscript. I had a really hard time with that because it was so not real. In 1965, the word Black was not used the way it is used today. So I used Negro most of the time. There's probably an occasional colored. I never used the N word, and I'm comfortable with that decision. I was uncomfortable for a while because, for example, they go to see a Klan rally, and I have Bob Jones, the Grand Dragon, up there bloviating about the Negroes, and that is not the word he would have used. But nobody has, I haven't heard any kind of objection from anybody. So I'm really glad that I cleaned up the language. And then I have one of the characters who is one of my favorite characters. He's one of the scope workers, and he is a young Black man. And he uses the word Black not to any of the Black people, because he says they would have been insulted by it at that time, historically. But he uses it on his own when he's talking to his friends, because he is on the cusp of the Black Power movement that's just beginning to be born. So from then on, Ellie, who's gotten very close to him, starts using the word Black too. So that's how I kind of educate the reader at that point to where that word came from and how it was being used in 1965.
That's really interesting. It was, you answered my next question already. In another interview that I saw that you did, you discussed the possibility of using a trigger warning. And could you tell us exactly what that is?
Well, the sensitivity reader made a suggestion that we have a trigger warning at the beginning of the book, which would be, I'm not going to say what it would say, no, because I'm not going to give you all a trigger warning. You know, in a children's book or even a young adult book, it might make sense to have a trigger warning, meaning something happens in the book that might trigger negative feelings in sensitive individuals. And so my editor and I agreed not to put one. I really, really reject the idea of a trigger warning in an adult book, because if I open a book and the first thing I see is, you know, oh, there's going to be a rape in this book, then the whole time I'm reading, I'm waiting for that to happen. And I don't want any of my readers to go into a book looking for something like that. So, by the way, I don't think there's any rape in this book. So don't worry about that. So anyhow, we decided not to do that. On Instagram last week, I put up a poll of trigger warnings. Do you want them? Do you not want them? And it was about 80% don't want them, and 20% said they would like them. So I'd be real curious to hear from some of you how you feel about that.
Interesting. So another question about this book specifically, was it hard for you to capture the voices of the characters that are in both time periods, because there's so many years between?
Well, I always, if I'm writing two different time periods, I always write them separately. And that way I don't lose the voice of the main character. And I also can immerse myself in that time period, the technology or lack of technology, that sort of thing. I don't get confused, and I really get to focus on one story at a time. And then I just pray that they're going to fit together once I have written those two storylines. And usually they do, with some tweaking. So that's how I worked on that.
That makes a lot of sense. Sherry wants to know, in at least one other novel, you have a character at UNC Chapel Hill. Do you have a personal connection?
I do not. However, I knew, let's say in this particular book, she was going to be a pharmaceutical student. So UNC Chapel Hill has a pharmacy program, and had a pharmacy program back in 1965 when Ellie was going to school. So it made sense for her to go there. And also geographically, it made sense because the town that she lives in, which is fictional, but it's in an area that Scope actually worked in, was an easy drive, a couple of hour drive from Chapel Hill. So that's why I picked Chapel Hill. And I don't remember which other book I had somebody go to Chapel Hill, probably several.
Yeah, I know there's at least one other that I've read, and I can't, the title, I can't remember which one it was either. So Anne wants to know, how was writing this book different from writing your previous books?
Well, lately I've really gotten into writing historicals. So it's not hugely different in terms of the fact that it's an historical novel. I don't really know how I ever fell into writing historical novels, because I always had been a contemporary writer. For about 20 books I wrote only contemporary. And then I guess it was Necessary Lies, which is about the eugenics program in North Carolina, that got me into writing about 1960. And then I became fascinated with recent 20th century history, especially of North Carolina, because it's just so rich in things that happened. So it didn't feel that different to me from the other books that I've written over the last few years.
So Mara would like to know, she says, you have published a book nearly every year for the past 30 years, exclamation point. Do you have a schedule you keep to write a certain number of hours a day, or a goal to write a certain number of words a day? Or do you just write without having those yardsticks in mind?
I used to, in my early years as a writer, maybe 15 books. I was really good. I had a set number of words I was going to work on each day. And I think when it all changed for me is when I developed rheumatoid arthritis in my late 40s. And I needed to sleep a lot. It was before the good medications, the biologic medications were out. So I was dealing with a lot of pain and a lot of need for sleep. And I just really couldn't work the way that I used to work. So I started just writing when I could, instead of putting that pressure on myself. And I've never put that pressure on myself since. I mean, it is a high pressure job because you've got a deadline. But I wasn't putting that daily pressure on myself of having to produce X number of words. So now I am incredibly undisciplined. I usually don't work a whole lot in terms of writing for the first maybe 6 months of a year contract. So I do a lot of research, which is really fun. And I do a lot of thinking and plotting, but the actual writing takes place probably the last 5 months of a contract. And then panic sets in, and I'm not fun to be around. And I can't do anything fun. But, with the pandemic, I haven't done anything fun anyhow. So the pandemic's been really good for writing.
Yeah, I guess it has for a lot of authors. I'm sure you're not the only one that was in that situation. So how do you come up with your ideas? Do you like, I know you said you just happened to find out about Scope and got fascinated. Is that generally what happens, or, how does that work?
Well, sometimes I'm hunting for an idea, or I hear about something and it triggers something. For example, the stolen marriage. The idea for that was triggered when I learned about the people of Hickory, North Carolina, in 1965. No, that's not right. In 1945, had a polio epidemic, and the hospital in Charlotte was completely packed. And so there was no place to put these young patients, and the people of Hickory banded together and built a polio hospital in 54 hours. And that always fascinated me. But if you read that book, you know that I don't even get to the hospital till the midpoint of the book. There's so much else going on. It's a Stolen Marriage is the title, so there's obviously a lot going on. But it was the hospital and the building of that hospital that triggered the initial idea. And then as I start thinking about an idea like that, all these other ideas start to bloom from it. Necessary Lies came from learning about the eugenics program in North Carolina and in many other states. And so then I just started thinking about a possible story that could come from, that could have to do with the eugenics program. So it's things like that that just kind of get in my mind, and I play with them until a story emerges.
So having read some of your books, it feels to me like they are all heavily influenced by your original choice of career, being a social worker and a psychotherapist. Is that true? And how do you draw from? Have you ever drawn any of your characters from indirectly, obviously, from any of your patients or your experiences there with that?
No, I can really honestly say no. You're right that having been a social worker, especially a hospital social worker, and having been a psychotherapist, gave me a lot of understanding of people and feelings about difficult situations. But I never have used anything from reality. When I left hospital social work and opened a private psychotherapy practice with teenagers, I had one book already out, my first book. And I just made sure that every parent and every teenager that I worked with knew that I was never going to use anything that I was privy to from their experience, that I would never use any of that they would not see themselves in one of my books. So, but, any kind of people-centric job gives you such an understanding of people and thus of characters. When young people who want to write talk to me about going into a creative writing program in college, what I always say is, you're going to learn to be a really good writer, but make sure that you've got some kind of volunteer work or something where it puts you in touch with people on a regular basis so that you're learning about people. I'm really, really glad for my background, not only because I loved those jobs, particularly hospital social work. I just loved it. But it also just gave me such an understanding of people, which is needed if you're going to create believable characters.
That makes perfect sense. Absolutely. So in talking about your characters, when you finally do get down to that serious writing point, do you already kind of know your characters and where they're going to go, or do your characters, are they more of a mystery to you, and they kind of tell you what they're going to do as you go along?
I think I know them. I've written pages and pages and pages of notes about them, but it's really funny because from page one, when they start talking and moving, they're not exactly who I thought they were going to be. And it's really true when you hear that the characters kind of push you around at the computer. They used to say push you around at the typewriter, but it really is the truth. As soon as they start opening their mouths and moving around on the page, it's like, what? I had no idea you were going to say that or sound like that or do this. And to me, that is the most exciting part of writing, is those surprises that come really from the characters. So I love when that happens.
Have you ever been in the middle of a book and just all of a sudden realized that you needed a new character that you hadn't even planned on? Has that ever happened to you?
Mhm.
Yeah.
Mhm. Yeah, and a lot of times it's to sort of flesh out the story. Um, sometimes X amount of people is just not enough to flesh out the story. So you need another, what's the word I want? Uh, a subplot. You need
Hmm.
something else going on with somebody else for your characters to interact with or to react to. So yes, I would say that that happens quite often.
That's interesting. It makes perfect sense. So how much, typically, how much is your final project, your final draft like?
Usually, the draft, I write very, very sloppy drafts. I don't edit as I go. And the reason for that is because the way my stories emerge from me, there are surprises along the way. And if I edit and make everything beautiful as I go, I'm just going to have to go back and change things to fit with what's all of a sudden coming later. So I just write really sloppily. I misspell. I just don't care. I don't use capitals. I just get everything down. And so that'll probably be like only 250 pages. And then I go back and I figure out what I need to build out this story. And I start editing and making it prettier. And that will probably get me to 350. And then, of course, it's just one more revision after another, usually maybe six revisions. And then it goes to my editor and my agent, and then they tell me everything that's wrong with it. And then I revise. And usually there's a couple of those revisions, and then we're good to go.
Have you ever really strongly disagreed with something, your editor or your yeah.
I don't think so. Except for saying black, calling people black in 1965. I disagreed with that, but we came to an agreement. Um, I have like a phenomenal editor, and I wanted to work with her from the very first book that I wrote. And now I've worked with her on 7 books. And she is just amazing. So when I get that revision letter from her, even if my heart sinks as I read it, once I start taking it apart and looking at her suggestions and things that she's concerned about, I just completely agree with her. The only thing is I'm the one that has to figure out how to fix it. She doesn't ever tell me how to, this is a good editor for you. She doesn't say, this is not working, here's how to fix it. This is not working. It's up to me to figure out, given the confines of my story and who my characters are, it's up to me to figure out how to make something work.
And you do it so well. One more character question. Do you mourn your characters when you're finished with your books, or are you ready to be done with them?
I definitely mourned a particular character in this story, but usually not. I will say that with my first novel, which was my baby, it took me years to write, and I was so attached to these characters. It's a terrible book, don't read it. But I just, at the time, I just loved it and loved these people. And I sent it off to the woman who was at that time my agent. And the next morning I walked into my office and I was like, they're gone. I was bereft because they were my people. And I think that's the only time that I've really had that feeling. Usually now it's like, oh, it's off my desk.
So is there some time before you start another book, or are you right on to another one?
Generally not. However, this past year, I did take a year off. I just felt like I needed it. I was really thinking about my friends who are my age, who have retired from their various jobs, not my writing friends, but friends who were teachers or whatever. And they're out, playing tennis every day and hanging out with their grandkids and just having a great old time, and I'm slogging away. So it started me thinking that maybe it was time to retire. And so I decided to take a year off and do jigsaw puzzles and just relax. And I got bored. So I realized that's not for me. However, it's okay to slow down. So I'm not going to be doing a book a year from here on out. It'd be more like a book every 2 years.
Well, you've certainly earned that after writing so many. Mindy asks, what kind of books do you like to read now? And what kinds of books did you like reading growing up?
Growing up, it's kind of a strange combination. I liked Victoria Holt, sort of the gothic, romancy, very gothic books. And I liked Sinclair Lewis, who probably nobody knows who that is anymore. But I read him in high school. We had to read one of his books. And don't ask me titles because I'm terrible at titles. But we read one of his books, and then I went to the library and just devoured all of them. And he was very much about social justice. So I had this gothic influence and this social justice influence, and I can see how both of them come across in my books. So who do I like to read now, or what do I like to read now? It just depends on the book, if it's a good book. I just finished a book by another North Carolina writer, Donna Eberhardt, called The Saints of Swallow Hill. And it's historical, set during the Depression in North Carolina on a turpentine camp, which I found really fascinating. But I did just read a James Patterson too, which I haven't read him in years. And it was very good. So it's sort of whatever comes my way and gets recommended, but I'm a really fussy reader because of the time it takes to read a book. I don't want to read something that doesn't grab me. I need to be grabbed pretty quickly. And that's why I try with my books to grab the reader pretty quickly. So I'm reading right now, I'm listening to on my walks, Heather Gudenkauf novel. She writes thrillers. I can't tell you the name of it, but it's her latest one. And that's keeping me entertained.
So Sherry says, I can't wait to suggest to my book club to read this book. Do you have book club questions already published somewhere?
Yeah, the book club questions are about, if they haven't been put up today on my website, they will be put up in the next few days. So yes, there's discussion questions. I also really enjoy visiting book clubs via Zoom. Used to be via Skype, now it's via Zoom. If I can fit it into my schedule, the time that you meet, I'm happy to do that.
That's exciting. Wow, great. Well, that was a very timely question. Pam asks, what was your favorite book of all that you have written?
Oh, that is really hard. I could go a bunch of different ways, but I think I'll say my third book, which is called Secret Lives, which is a good story. But the reason that it's my personal favorite is because my first two novels, I really didn't know what I was doing. And This book, Secret Lives, I figured it out. I figured out how to add a little suspense, even though it's got a romance in it. It's pretty romancy, but it has tension, it has surprises, a little bit of mystery, and an interesting story of a woman who is in the 40s. She has agoraphobia. The word is never used, but she's afraid to be out in the world, so she actually lives in a cave. And I just love that story. And I love the fact that if I look at that book now, I can see Diane Chamberlain's voice. Whereas if I look at my first two books, I can see Anne Rivers Siddons and Alice Hoffman and all these other voices of whoever I was reading at the time. I really didn't have my own until that third novel. So that's really one of my favorites.
That's really interesting. I thought you were going to say you couldn't pick. I mean, you have so many that.
Well, it is really hard to pick.
Yeah, I bet. So to our listeners, we still have some time. If anyone has any other questions, please go ahead and type them into the Q&A now so that we can ask Diane those questions before we have to let her go. And meanwhile, I have another question. Is there anything in particular that you really enjoy about being a novelist?
There's a lot that I enjoy. First of all, I have been, since I was able to think as a small child, a story maker-upper. And I never would fall right asleep at night, and I still don't. I would make things up. So as a little kid, my parents would put me to bed and think that I was, getting my 8 or 9 hours of sleep, but I was really getting 5 because I was just lying there making up stuff. And it's so wonderful to have an outlet for that. It's so wonderful to be able to make stuff up and make a living at it. Who knew? When I was young, a kid, and early teens, I thought, I would be a writer. But then I started thinking writers really don't make a living, which is true of a lot of writers. And I need a career that I can actually make a living at. And that's why I dropped the idea of becoming a writer and went into social work. Which is not a real high money making job either, but I have absolutely no regrets about that. But ultimately, the storytelling won out.
Well, certainly your stories would be very different if you had not had that first career.
That is so true. I don't know what I would have written about.
Well, you might have had a different career and your stories would have gone a different way, but we're glad that they went the way they did. So what's next for Diane? Do you have something?
Well, I'm playing with ideas right now, and I think it'll probably be another book where I've got 2 separate ideas that I'm going to merge. And I've got one of the ideas, and I'm working on the second idea, which is connected to the first idea, but you don't know that. See, I'm not going to talk about it.
Oh no, I don't expect
it's still too close to my heart to be able to discuss it. And also, I don't know what's going to change. I just don't know. I don't have enough of it solidified in my head to be able to talk about it yet.
No, that makes perfect sense. I guess I just want to make sure that there was another one coming at some point.
There's another one. Not sure when it'll be, but it's taking shape.
Well, that's good. That's good news for all of your fans out there. I don't see any other questions, and I I think I've asked you every one I had. I had a whole page.
You had good questions. Very good questions.
Thank you. So is there anything else that you'd like to just share with us? Give people another minute or two in case another question comes in, or?
Well, I love feedback. So I'm on Facebook, I'm on Instagram. I'm not very active on Twitter, but get in touch with me. And of course, you can get in touch with me through my website too. I love to hear your feedback, what works for you, what doesn't work for you, how you feel about the story and the characters. So do share with me your thoughts and feelings.
All right. Well, I guess we've exhausted all the questions. So I'm going to just say thank you so much, Diane, for being with us. Show everybody the book one more time. This is what you're looking for. It's a great book. And selfishly, I'm hoping that your next book will also have a historical base in it, because I think those books are especially fascinating. And with that, I will say thank you, patrons. Thank you for being with us tonight. Thank you again, Diane. And we hope to have you back when your next book comes out.
Thanks so much for having me.
All right. Good night, everyone.
Good night.